good evenings and welcome to Faculty of Architecture, Chulalongkorn University. I won't waste your time because you wait too long already. Sorry for any troublesome of our technical problem here, but right now we solve it. And I think this is a good time. Today I would like to thank you, Professor David Erdman. He's the founding directors of the PRATT Institute of Center of Climate Adaptation, right? I'm sorry if I'm wrong. This is very interesting because one, I just saw the poster and I saw the project of Singapore and just came back from Singapore and know that Singapore is preparing for any climate change and disaster in the future because all of their climation projects on the South Sea is kind of related to the project that preventing the disaster in the future with the climate change. So I'm also looking forward to see that as well. And there could be a lot of things that Professor David would like to show us about the projects that related to the climate change of the world. So just don't waste your time, just welcome and just hope you have a good evenings and enjoy your lecture. And we hope that we can have a good discussion after that. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for your patience while we sorted out the technical issues. Thank you, Dean Suryat, for hosting me this evening, and Koch for co-hosting. And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight to hear a little bit about what we're doing at the Center for Climate Adaptation at Pratt Institute. Oops, let's see if this works now. Now it doesn't want to work. There we go, look at that. The center was started in 2024. After about 5 years of development, we are a provost center, so I work with the deans and the chairs at the provost level. We have yeah, maybe I'm too far. There we go. Okay. We're gonna get this right yet. We are located in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. This is an active Navy Yard where they still build nuclear subs in Brooklyn. The green roof is our building here. We're on the top floor underneath this green roof. And this is a tech incubator. WeWork originally was here. The green roof, operated by Brooklyn Grange, I think kind of sets the tone for the building, which is in and of itself an adaptive reuse building. There are lots of different activities that we do at the center. It brings together the 4 provost centers and all the research centers of Pratt Institute. Films have been shot there. Koch has been involved in workshops there. And we have a collateral space on Governor's Island. We're part of the climate exchange there, which I'll share a little bit more about, and one of the organizations in residency. So archipelagos are our focus, and there's a few reasons why these are important to our center, and they might be important to a city like Bangkok or a country like Thailand or anybody who's in or adjacent to the Malay archipelago. The primary reason we're in them is all archipelagos are water scarce and land scarce. Even though they get a lot of heavy rain, they often don't retain it. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has identified these 4 drivers as causing the largest loss of life and human migration by 2050. So I would argue all 4 of these are related to water, but certainly 2 of the 4 are. Issues around water and water safety are not new in North America. This is basically the environment of risk that we often talk about, escalating through 2100 into 2200. And certainly in the public psyche of New York, there are a lot of concerns about what the city is going to look like if and when rising tides and storm surge happens. And that kind of sets the tone for where we're at. I've found similar depictions of Bangkok that seem pretty wild and threatening in terms of what you all are facing here. What has changed since Resilience 1.0, which was really the last 25 years, though this is not new to Bangkok, is heightened awareness and concern around rain. So in New York City, we're seeing more disruptive events to operations, economics, and human health safety, just based on rain events, not necessarily hurricanes. And you've had some pretty spectacular versions of this here. This was Hong Kong the same month, September of 2023. Hong Kong has the most hardened stormwater infrastructure on the planet, and this is what happened to it in this storm a little bit over a year ago, which is pretty wild to see. And of course, here you see this on a regular basis. Areas throughout Bangkok flood when it rains. And this is important for a couple of reasons. This is not necessarily new, but what is new is the framing and why this relates to islands. Up until the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a nonpartisan international panel of scientists, only the continents were included in this ranking through Assessment Report 5. It was not until Assessment Report 6 that they included small islands. And what is striking about this, if you look at it closely, is you're probably thinking that is the most stressed area. And that is only because people have been looking at continents up until 2022. Again, it's not until then that folks start looking at islands and trying to aggregate it and understand what the challenges and vulnerabilities are. And why that's interesting is it's on islands that we see what's called pluvial or rain events connected with coastal events. So it is very difficult on islands which are land scarce and water scarce to disconnect rain events from coastal events. And they are accelerating more rapidly, and that makes them very interesting areas to study. There are a lot of challenges with that. That's the left side of this wheel. There are a lot of opportunities with it. Islands are historically well positioned as piloting areas, as scalable test beds. They comprise over 50% of the fastest growing areas on the planet. Islands do, either on their own or within municipalities. And based on our estimations, about 1 to 1.5 billion people live on islands across the planet. So a lot of people think islands could disappear, they could flood, they would go away. These statistics would argue otherwise. It's about 20% of the global GDP, about 15% of the global population, which is pretty significant. And so that kind of sets the basis for what we're looking at the Center for Climate Adaptation. Tonight's talk, because this is a School of Architecture, I thought I would share a little bit of my background in architecture and how I arrived at Archipelagos. I'll share a couple of our projects. I'll try to connect some points to Bangkok and Thailand, and then I'll end with a few reflections on what all of this means for higher education. And I'll try to keep us relatively on time, even though we started late. So my early work was a lot of full-scale installations. I was trained during what's called the digital turn. I did a lot of robotic fabrication, worked a lot with leading galleries internationally, and showed projects throughout that we were able to build in environments. And what is interesting about this work is all of it had remote sensing equipment in it that would bring together the motion of people, lighting, data that was being pumped through these systems. So there was already, at this early stage, I think a kind of latent interest on my part of micro-scale infrastructures and how they interact with architecture, or how architecture could both absorb them and respond to things beyond its building enclosure or envelope. That became a bigger interest of mine as I launched our practice in Hong Kong. This was about a decade of work that I did with Clover Lee. I lived and resided and taught in Hong Kong for that period of time. And we did a lot of adaptive reuse projects. We used brand new building codes for it. We worked on some landscapes. We did some standalone buildings. But this work, which started pretty humbly and small, looked at, again, those relationships between fixed systems and mobile systems, between skins and motion. This is the biggest platform in Hong Kong, the heaviest platform and installation we did there. And in all of these projects, it was looking at how the building could be absorbent of other data and other systems that could be driving the enclosure or the interiors, and how those might relate to their surroundings. So these projects were, if you will, trying to imagine that they were pulling the landscape in. So a lot of architecture is very centrifugal and tries to reach out and grab the landscape. This assumes that you can kind of tuck it into your building, that you can suck in your belly and pull the landscape into these areas. And a lot of the studies for the building enclosure in these areas were about that. In Hong Kong, we did several larger scale projects. Some of these we were able to build our own ground, so we could look vertically at how the ground and the towers, how water and or other infrastructural systems like planting, etc., might be able to be absorbed between there. And in other projects, how the skin could shed light and color to activate the surroundings around it. So starting to get beyond the scale of the site itself. These involved a lot of hands-on work, different scales of work, full-scale prototypes here at the scale of towers, different client bases, client structures, different building codes, different construction logics and systems. But underneath all of it was an infrastructure of design. There was a set of modeling methods that allowed us to study what certain relationships were across different systems. So again, fixed and mobile. Here it was looking at the patterning on the skin to circulatory systems. That was kind of where my interest in small-scale infrastructures and islands starts. You can read more about it in this book that Clover and I put together called A Mass, which captures some of that work. And I would argue it pertains to some of my writing. When I taught at Hong Kong U, I oversaw the lecture series there. And this lecture series brought together Takashi Murakami, the artist. It brought together product designers, landscape architects, theorists, and architects. So people with pretty different backgrounds on themes that they had never really thought about or discussed. And my job as a writer was to develop an algorithm, basically, for writing 1,000-word essays that would bring all of these different people together. And I share that as an example. You can see more of it in the introductions book or in the PRATT sessions book, to just say the interest here, and I think what's interesting about archipelagos is they're almost as exploded as they are cohesive. And it's difficult, even with data, to figure out how they cohere together. And that was part of the launching point for the center. We launched, our soft launch was in 2023 around the second UN Water Conference. And we aspired to bring together as many different archipelagos as we could in our first 5 years. This is a UN registered agenda. Whoops. And the goal was to start looking around, finding the archipelagos. You all are kind of in this territory, and build coalitions across different areas. We have about 25 people in New York, about 50 people globally, and we now have 6 centers that are in different stages of development. The first 3 were with Singapore University of Technology and Design and Pace University, then UDD in Chile and Patagonia. Our most recent addition is Aalto University, and we have a standing agreement with Anant in India. The idea was to get a good cross-section of disciplines and also get member partners with technical firms like Aegis, Tom Kendall's here tonight from there, and Arcadis, and use all of that work to begin to get into climate adaptation more aggressively and accelerate what we could do there. There are 3 basic areas that we work on: projects and climate innovation, entrepreneurship and new economic lines, and then climate literacy, which is kind of the educational arm of what we do. We started in the northeastern and the Malay archipelago, and we're now in the Patagonian and Scandinavian archipelagos. The northeastern archipelago is a system of estuaries, barrier islands, and archipelagos that stretches from basically Virginia to Maine. As I mentioned earlier, we're mostly working on Governor's Island here. In 2023, we won the New York Climate Exchange. That's part of what launched my center. That's a partnership with the State University of New York. It's the first of its kind institution just across from Wall Street that'll bring together 12 universities and private industries to think about how to adapt throughout the New York archipelago and beyond. The island itself is quite interesting. Almost half of it is devoted to new development. That's all on reclaimed land. That's about 4.5 million square feet on an island that is very much under threat by rising tides, has no arterial connections. And so it presents that island and the other islands in the archipelago present a variety of issues we're touching upon. I'll share a little bit more about that later. The Malay Archipelago, our home there is Singapore, so we are trying to spread our work out and around the archipelago, but we've been based in Singapore, mostly on the eastern coast. Changi is here, Marina Bay is here. We've been working more in Kalong and Katong than Kalong, Katong, and Siglap. On the Long Island project, this is not to be confused with Long Island, New York. This is a big coastal defense project on the East Coast that we're getting involved with as part of a consortium there. It will have the 18th, is this my laser pointer? 18th largest, the newest reservoir at the top, and will defend Singapore from rising tides. This is a kind of back bay area. This is one of the renderings of that project as it's envisioned to develop. Pretty exciting, brings together the pluvial and the coastal. And in Patagonia, we're working in the city of Castro. This is on the largest and northernmost island of Patagonia. So Chile is about 1/3 archipelago. The Patagonian archipelago is here. Chiloé is that red island, the largest island. And the Chilotan archipelago has about 250,000 inhabitants, about a dozen cities. So this is the most rural archipelago that we're working in, that is seeing a lot of potential development. There's a new bridge, there is a new airport, there's a freeway expansion along Route 5, and this part of the archipelago has the heaviest amount of aquacultural fishing industry, which makes toxicity a really big issue here. It sees about the equivalent of New York City of nitrogen waste discharged into the archipelago every day. So it has a pretty heavy load on the archipelago itself. It is also water scarce. There are communities that live on the water, so there are interesting forms of reclamation or stilted dwellings that you also find throughout Southeast Asia. But what's unique about these is they see about 6 to 8 meters of tidal fluctuation per day. So this is kind of in the top 10 next to the Bay of Fundy. So these tidal flats, you'll see this, they totally fill up every day. And so it's pretty dynamic and interesting as a context to study. And the last and newest archipelago is the Finnish archipelago. Aalto University has historically been working in the south here. What sparked our collaboration was an eye toward the north, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and their port in the north is really key in bringing together the EU, North America, and Russia. And you see what that does to the transit time. So as the polar cap thaws, there's a lot of discussion about urbanization and transit in the northern part. And this is our most remote archipelago. You can get a glimpse of what that looks like. So the methods that we use and bring together range from more traditional methods to more contemporary methods. Some of it's traditional sketching, looking at district scale work. Some of it's traditional montaging and collages, looking at different scales and types of work. A lot of this is to bring out the realism of the sites and the qualities of the sites. We couple that with a lot of artificial intelligence work. So the AI work is not intended to be solutions. These are really meant to be really fast iterations. So we'll look at more hardened, less nature-based solutions versus more nature-based, less hardened solutions within the scope of a couple of hours, and test those out and have discussions with various stakeholders. So what's really nice about it and very architectural about it is it's iterative. So you can move through a lot of variations, which I think aligns with architectural training very nicely. And you can dial up and down very different kinds of scenarios, like extreme retreat versus living on top of a seawall, for example. So two very different conditions. We couple that with different types of building analysis and envisioning. So traditionally, architecture students and urban designers would work over here in the urban arena GFA. We're trying to move over to this side, which is how does a building capture water? How does a building bake nature-based systems into it? There's lots of other mapping techniques that are trying to map architecture into other structures, like sections for islands or mapping for whole archipelagos. And a lot of that comes together in these navigation panes that we build that bring together different scales of work. So we use video to try to pull together a lot of different data. So the design infrastructure, if you will, is cinematic to do anything from bring together more live footage and maps to more technical information at the scale of a building. Sometimes this can be more linear, so we'll introduce kind of the background and the context, like here, before we'll jump into more technical data and think about how a building can filter or reuse its own water and what that capacity might be for itself or the surrounding neighborhoods. For medium scale infrastructure, this gets a little bit more interesting. I gotta scoot this video along if I can find my cursor here. I hope it doesn't get stuck again. So here we can bring together different kinds of data, from live footage to mapping to sections to more hyper-realistic footage. So this is, I think, the most difficult scale. This is not that different from the building that Land Process has on campus here. And then at the scale of full archipelagos, we'll mix it up a little bit, bring together architectural techniques, more traditional mapping, and live footage techniques. So across all of the projects, we try to hit these 5 key points. Generally, what we're suggesting is islands should not be off-grid. A lot of them are interdependent on dams or other systems to feed them. We're suggesting it should be complementary, that they should be working toward better resourcing and net zero water, and looking, as much as we look at flood disaster, look at resource management. So how can we use cloudburst or community aggregation to build resources? Those could be emergency resources, those could be positive resources, and at every touch point, try to understand how that's scalable. I'll briefly share 2 projects at very different scales that we did for New York City and one in Hong Kong, since it's close to here. This is looking at rebooting a building from the inside out. So typically in climate projects and architecture, it's typically the skin that does a lot of the performance. Here, what we're looking at is rebooting the cores, which are these white masses within the existing buildings, which are clear, and building those with on-site robotics. So you cut the building open. Because it's a retrofit, on-site robotics are better than prefabrication. There's lots of interesting issues that are emerging in this project. These are all historically landmark buildings, so what areas you can touch versus what areas you can't touch, how you take an antiquated system of distributed toxic energetics and reboot that to centralized cleaner energy. And of course, just the construction logistics of reworking a building from the inside out, cutting it open and then moving toward the perimeter. I call this the fireplace of the future. So if fireplaces were a really big deal in the mid-1800s to bring energy to buildings, this is kind of the water equivalent. So it's a big rain tank parked in the middle of your building that's robotically fabricated, serves all your wet walls, all your water reuse infrastructure. And what's important about this is it basically shifts buildings from being inert, which you see on the top here, to being more absorbent, which you see on the bottom. So what we're trying to do at every scale is get buildings to become part of the watershed and part of that system. And what that means in the US quite often is it's a public-private partnership. So at the smallest scale, you could have individual homeowners. You might get buy-in from the larger community across a district. That may trigger grants from the city, which could trigger public spaces. And then that may produce offsets for emergencies or bona fide water supplies. So a lot of the work in Resilience 1 and 2.0 has been public green space. It assumes cities can afford to continue to build their own infrastructure. This assumes they cannot, that you have to use small scale, patchy, private investment to get other scales, to get closer to where we should be in the Sustainable Development Goals, because we're grossly behind. So again, the scalability, start with 3, go to a district, go across a much larger area. Bring together rain, bring together resource and flood management. The second project I'll briefly share is a large-scale waterfront park on the south side of Hong Kong. This park existed. It's all reclaimed land. The office park behind it also existed, and this was a renovation of the park and an addition, if you will, to the existing office infrastructure. For those of you that don't know the Hong Kong archipelago, it's about 256 islands. This is called the Blue Crescent. It's quite ecologically sensitive. The historic development models in Hong Kong have been on the northern shore of the island. The south part of the island and east and west areas are now really being studied, and this is the area of our study for the Cyberport organization, which is part of the city. And what's interesting about these shorelines is a lot of the urban villages still have land rights to fish and swim and use these shorelines. They're toxic, they are very dangerous during flash floods. They're also stunning and very compelling landscapes. And so our job in this study was to try to figure out a way in the face of rising tides and various vulnerabilities to keep that community in place and using that shoreline. So we shared with them some of the ways it's currently being used, ways that we thought could be sustained, but not necessarily in the same format, because swimming in front of a combined sewer outlet is not safe, typically. We mapped certain types of seawall structures that were here along that shoreline, looked at ones that could be introduced, how those would affect non-human habitat, and put together a suggestion that they mix systems. So you will also see, kind of like some of the earlier work I was sharing, these are coarse systems. So this is not all green and blue. It is not all gray. It's going to bring together a mixture of the two. So it's going to have different variables of gray, blue, and green, and try to bring all of that together all at once. This project captures water coming off the peak, high velocity water, captures it and reuses it. It also carves out reclaimed land to store and recharge coastal habitat and filter additional water. It pops up vertically all of the public programs onto the 4th floor, and then uses a series of terraces and a mass timber building skin as a filtrative landscape. So you kind of have to coil all of that up and make it quite vertical to get capacity here. Echoes of which you can see in our study was just a study to inform the final project, but you can see they elevated it, the terraces, some of the water reuse aspects are still in it. So At this point, I'll just share a kind of overview and then talk a little bit about maybe some of the connections to Bangkok. So as a center, we are looking at islanding, not only islands. So while our concentration is on archipelagos, the concept of islanding, at least to the US military, as a strategy against climate change is not wholly new. And it's interesting to look at the metrics they lay out to deal with climate change. A lot of it's about microgrids, a lot of it's about water. And it's really a way of re-envisioning the term carrying capacity. So if any of you are studying landscape architecture or have a background in ecology or urban ecology, you would know that carrying capacity means that you're developing a habitat that can sustain that human or non-human species. We're saying instead of retreat, because the economic drivers usually win, you have to come up with pathways for capacity that allows also for economic development. So it's a kind of distortion of that term. We are also suggesting that innovation has nothing to do with anything new. We use a lot of technology, but if you look up the definition of architectural innovation, nowhere in that definition does it say new stuff. It just says you're shuffling stuff. This project in the background, Asia Society in Hong Kong, is only 30% new construction. It is mostly landscape preservation and building preservation. It's a mixture of landscape, architecture, and urban design. I would argue that none of your careers are likely to be architecture alone. They're probably going to be mixtures of conservation, preservation, landscape, and urban design. And you have a lot of this. Hong Kong has a lot of this. You need to figure out how to work with this. And what we're suggesting is that's got to be the resource. You stop borrowing it from other places. We have to start believing and working together to think about how that can harvest water and nature-based systems. So all of that's a pretty different attitude about islands. Islands historically are not seen as valuable at all unless you add land to them. Since the early 1900s, this was the case in New York City. The economics of this are very real. It's cheaper to borrow land from other places and charge more on an island for real estate. Same pattern in Singapore. So islands in many ways, and for many decades and centuries, you could argue have been forced to behave like land. And that's how their economics are driven. And we're saying, well, maybe there's other ways to find that value if you include the built landscape within the economy of resources. We also borrow water. Again, archipelagos are land scarce and they're water scarce. There's very few archipelagos, very few, that can supply their own water. Singapore's the blue chip model. It's 50% water independent. New York City's 0%. We own all of our reservoirs upstate, but none of that's on the archipelago. And I'll share in a minute why that's problematic. It sets up some interesting geopolitics. In Singapore, they're borrowing 50% of their water from Malaysia. That's a lease that will run out in 2060. And in Chiloy, a lot of the surface water is running off. They get a lot of rain, but a lot of it's going away, so they're seeing a lot of drought, as I mentioned earlier. So these issues kind of cut across the different archipelagos. So how might we reconnect the dots between what I'm sharing from New York? How can we learn from each other and collaborate? I think that's why I came down here today, to share with you all some observations and a little bit about what we're doing. For those of you that don't know, New York City has one of the biggest coastal defense projects being built, the Big U. Our researchers are part of that. Edgar Westerhoff from Arcadis is part of our team. Parts of this have been built. Other parts of it are in design development or construction. I sit on advisory committees for these. This is the east coast of New York. This is the west coast. That's almost built. This is about to be built. Different lessons, more reaches, fancier seawalls, so some of these flip up and are hydraulically elevated. New methods of construction, a lot of geofoam rather than dirt or sand for areas that are being recontoured. and a lot of lessons from the surrounding islands. If you look throughout the archipelago of New York City, you'll see the integration of nature-based systems in berms. For example, on Governor's Island, that's all afforestation. Up in Long Island City, there's spreading grounds that are recharge basins that are cleaning and purifying water, that are new blue, green, gray hybrid structures, and even artificial structures for interpier habitat that are emerging in New York City. This is all important because our national organization that looks at coastal defense, the Army Corps of Engineers, is used to hardened gray systems. They know they won't kill people. They know you can insure them. So that's the baseline. There's a very large plan and proposal. This will go into implementation by 2030 to build more defense systems throughout the tri-state area, called the Harbors and Tributaries Study that New York's concentrated on right now. This is part of what we're looking at. And coupled with that, a lot of interest to bring in nature-based systems into those solutions. Yet, nature-based systems, according to the Army Corps of Engineers, are not structural. That means they're decorative. They can be used for habitat restoration, but they can't defend human lives. So there's a whole bunch of research, if you really want to go that direction, around what is that capacity? What has that capacity in an urban or rural setting? There's similar progress around rainwater. There are rules that we've developed that help hold more water. There are cloudburst programs in New York City that are looking at using, and are currently using, parks and public space to hold water. We've recognized that we can't redo our plumbing system. It's billions of dollars to do that, so that is not a pathway out. But the pathway to date has largely been to say we're going to use all the parks. That'll get you only 14% of the gray water demand of New York City, 1/4, in the space between buildings. If you really want to push what you're doing and accelerate it, at some point buildings have to become part of the watershed. By our estimates, you could satisfy another 66% of the total demand of gray water if every roof and facade in New York City was used to capture water. This is important to us because we're losing a lot of water in the region, as I mentioned earlier. If you look over the last century, you can see the Great Plains of the West Coast and the Southwest, which you would think about for droughts. New York City is amongst the hot spots because we're an archipelago. We saw wildfires this year. We've been getting smoke from them for the past 5 years. And according to this Cornell study, the Hudson River Valley is one of the fastest growing areas for climate change in all of North America. And the evidence is pretty clear. We're seeing droughts repeatedly throughout our watershed on a regular basis. And levels of salinity are climbing in the region, making the watershed more toxic. So pathways toward net zero water, pathways toward bringing together coastal and rainwater are on the radar. That's part of our Resource New York study that I shared the stats from earlier. That will require more data points. We have a very crude and limited remote sensing system right now in New York City. There's only about 200 sensors installed monitoring flooding. Singapore has a very healthy one. Helsinki has a pretty good one. What we're looking at is digital twinning. So this is kind of another level of the use of AI. This is used for vehicles, it's used for buildings, it's used for transit systems, but it allows you in the design phase to understand how urban interventions might perform for capacity. This is kind of like BIM modeling on steroids. And why it's might be important to you to think about is this has entered the climate space, but most of it's around carbon. So the conversation for digital twinning right now is almost exclusively around energy. It pencils, block power has shown that, but very little of it is looking at water or nature-based systems. And these are areas that we think are ripe for study and would be invaluable to have digital twins of. as we get deeper into the 21st century. So how might some of this connect back to Thailand and or Bangkok? You sit within Southeast Asia, technically adjacent to the Malay archipelago. Arguably, your archipelagos are part of that, as is Taiwan and Hong Kong. Even within your national definition, understanding what the impact of islands is within Thailand is a little bit murky. There are 3 general regions that are identified as having concentrated numbers of islands, but there's over 1,400 islands within Thailand. So it's a lot more than the 20 most popular ones that people go to. This is just a scroll through like the first couple hundred of them. There's a lot of complexity here. Some of them are on borders. The geology of these areas is very compelling and interesting. This is Phung Nga Bay, which many of you may know of, for their karst formations. And the economics of these regions are important. By my eyeball, which I did in the ramp up to coming here, it's about 10 to 12% of your GDP is attributed to islands. And a lot of that's because of the growth in the service sector that Thailand's seeing as your primary industry. That's projected to go up. And again, if you look at the regions, depending on where and when you look at it, islands seem to be pretty big performers in that landscape, as do other flood vulnerable areas like Bangkok. So, how we get into understanding the dynamics of archipelagos and how they can work at a larger scale of the Malay archipelago or the smaller archipelagos within Thailand is certainly a subject that could be discussed. Your government's looking at sustainable island tourism. There are royal initiatives around island sustainability. But I presume when most of you think about flooding and threats, you're looking at the area up at the top here. You're thinking about Bangkok, because that is the area that freaks everybody out in terms of where you're going to be by 2100 and the operability and livability of an urban region like this. You too are seeing pretty intense droughts. They might be a bit more intense on the islands, but they spread throughout here. That's accelerated. This is from 2018. And you're borrowing a lot of water from other areas to make things work. Yeah, there are diversionary tactics, infrastructural tactics to get water here. You are not, other than sourcing landscapes, as far as I know, you don't have a substantial reuse program, or at least it could be enriched and discussed more aggressively. There are obviously some plans for coastal defense that are emerging in the past couple of years. Some are a little bit more spectacular than others. Your former prime minister and his party seem to be dreaming up some pretty wild ideas about defense off the coast of Bangkok. One of the big drivers, it seems to me, could be the Belt and Road Initiative. You are part of that initiative. You're in an economic development zone. It seems like you're seeing some of the assets of that development, which is largely concentrated around rail work, in addition to the maritime routes, and some of that's already in place and or designed to go into place. So this is likely to really transform your region, and it already seems to be transforming some of your economics. So, thinking more like this is getting there. Big nod to land process, big nod to Chula Yu, to getting one of these projects off the ground early. These are incredible projects that we see universities and firms here spearheading. And there are also interesting, even more recent examples of reuse, like the old tobacco factory that Turnscape did. And these are fantastic projects, but most of the water that's being reused in them is being reused for the landscape. It's not yet escalating to the point of being reused for gray water within the buildings, et cetera. So that could be a subject to talk about. I'll end with a few observations on how this sits in the landscape of higher education. What I think is important to understand is we're very behind in the area of water, and archipelagos are, we hope, important to accelerating this. The very first water conference, the first time the United Nations turned away from World War II, was in 1972 in Stockholm. And the big players here are Stockholm, Singapore, Japan, and Greece. All of them are archipelagos. There are cautionary tales in this meeting that we're going to run out of water, that the planet's going to heat up, that there's going to be a bunch of migration. It gets a lot of architects and urban designers excited, gets a lot of scientists excited about what's going on. And then in 1973, a year later, we run out of gas. And everybody freaks out and shifts to carbon. All the scientists who start forming intergovernmental panels a decade later, the seeds of the Sustainable Development Goals, are mostly focused around heat and energy. This is really important stuff. It will affect human lives. But what you need to be reminded of is it's not going to affect them as fast as water will. And this is why, mostly why, the SDGs are failing. So the SDGs were launched in 2015. They're an outcome of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They start right around the same time. And what's interesting about them, what's shocking about them is they're failing. Water is failing pretty horribly within this landscape. Is that a lot of discussion happens around these top two tiers, economics and society. Those are kind of the entry points. But this diagram, I think, really nicely points out the foundational importance of the green and blue infrastructures that need to underlie those systems. You can't do anything with the top two if you're not doing work on the bottom four. That's what this diagram is trying to teach you. And most architecture schools are still here. Landscape architecture less so. Arguably, it deals more with water. But we tend to be focused on new stuff, new buildings, new technology, new materials, reused materials. That puts a small dent in where we are, and that will be important later. It's not unimportant work, but water is pretty urgent today. So one of the ways that we've been trying to get universities out of their comfort zone is literally get students and faculty out of the university around bigger events. And the first one that we did this with was the UN Water Conference in 2023, the second water conference after the 1972 Water Conference. 50 years it takes the UN to have conference number 2 on water. There have been over a dozen environmental conferences, and it took them 50 years to come back to water, mostly because people were realizing there's a real problem here. This was a high-level panel at the UN. There was a symposium on PRATT's main campus, and then a workshop at our space. These are ways of getting students and faculty out of the classroom together with community leadership. It brings together folks from around the world, landscape architects, brainstorming, talking about what they can do in different regions. They look kind of like this. The language many of you are probably familiar with, sketching and Post-its. But I would argue this is really not sufficient for communicating with policymakers or communities. They just, we understand this to some extent because we're trained to understand abstract plans. But it's not until they see something like this that tells them how many blocks we'll have to move to get a fairly hardened system in to Daylight Creek, or how many more we'll have to move if they do a softer version of this, that they really begin understanding what the impact is. And AI can help us with that. If nothing else, it helps get you in front of thought leaders, in front of world leaders, in front of community leaders to start arguing those points. We've run 4 of these now. The second one in Singapore, looking at the East Coast and Long Island. The third one is the longest and the biggest. This is a 2,500 kilometer expedition where we charter a boat to go through almost the entirety of the Patagonian archipelago. North is to the left, south is to the right here. And students work with us. They work with the control tower. They develop proposals for land use surveying the landscape and trying to understand what some of the key critical components are in the area. And meet with community leaders by the time we get further south. The most recent one that we ran, the fourth one, was around Singapore International Water Week this summer in Singapore. That was able to bring together all of our centers. This was a great program. Koch and Tom were both involved with this. But again, we get students from multiple universities, from multiple countries, faculty from all those areas, mixed with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Singapore's Public Utilities Board, engineering firms, working live, getting into the thick of it, trying to figure out what the issues are that are here. They're exciting, they're sloppy, but we are enjoying using these kinds of structures that really are fairly complex events. In New York, every fall, we do something around the high-level summit on islanding. These are coupled with exhibitions where we share the work that we've been doing around the world. This past year, we worked with SOM, who put together an exhibition called The Tale of Two Islands, looking at Roosevelt Island and Governor's Island. And with Foster and Partners, who did a proposal in 1975 for the Canary Islands to get it to be water independent, that they recently pulled out of the archive and reused for a Maldives master plan that was just relaunched in 2024. We have other types of arts and artists and performance involved in this work. We highlight different areas and do as much outreach as we can to bring together and connect international and local agencies. We give different tours. We had about 6,000 people on the island this past year. And we have a growing repertoire of workshops bringing people in from around the world who are coming to Governor's Island and the Brooklyn Navy Yard to work with us, from Taiwan, from London, and other places, as well as government agencies that we're working with locally and internationally on issues of water reuse and water independence. Archipelagos are tough to understand, and even the islanding logic I don't think is easy to get your head around. And so I'm a big fan of getting students and faculty into the field to engage these communities. I think the studio model is great, but we really need to challenge educational environments to get out and beyond. If we're really going to get serious about what carrying capacity might mean, we should be going there to try to understand what some of these environments can do and offer. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of what we're up to in the Center for Climate Adaptation. Thanks for your patience today and your time. I don't know if we ran over there, but thanks everybody. Do you want me to take questions, or are we too far over?
About that. I think we have time for like quick round question, maybe more than two questions. So yes, we open the floor.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming today, and we give us a super. I think it's really impressed when you wrapping everything around into these lectures. I am also a PRATT alumni. I've been in design management programs as a class of 2020, and so sad that I'm not in the time that your climate center has been waking up. And I saw a lot of the opportunity you work with, and I just like, when I was student in a grad school in the design management, we also working something around this, but not with physical, but in terms of business model, and how can we use business to tap into sustainability developments and make it sustainability in terms of economy as well. So I think it's not questions. What I'm going to say is not questions to ask you, but I just think that design management, leading by Dr. Marion McBride, may be another good connector with you for the PRATT Climate Center as well, because we had done a lot of things about sustainability, about climate change, but we do in the business side of that. And I think if if you and Dr. Mary could connect, it's really great.
Yeah, happy to. Our senior advisor is Hank Oving, who's the executive director for the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, and he works with two heads of state, President Macron of France and President Tarman of Singapore. They just released their first report, which is really the very first attempt to talk about what the global impact of water stresses will be on operations and the economics of countries globally. So I encourage you all to take a look at that. But he really set the stage for our center. It's part of why we're partnered with Pace University. We work with their environmental law and their environmental business programs there. And everything that we do, we try to involve finance. So we ask architecture students, as opposed to historically leaving that in the business school. Some of the graphics that I showed earlier today, the students have to make a financial case for why storing water would pencil. And that may be imaginative and speculative because there may not be policies in place today that allow for that, but finding what policies could be good drivers for that exist within those cities or within similar cities and archipelagos is often what we ask them to do. And I think it's absolutely critical to include finance in the discussion of design, that you cannot see design as exempt from finance. When I graduated, there was a belief that other people would find the money to make your project. That is definitely not true today. So if you don't have an idea about how to make it work financially, you're probably not going to get hired. You may not know how to do all of it, but just like you would have to understand structure or hydrology in landscape architecture or architecture, I would argue in both, you also now, this generation needs to understand finance as part of that equation and work with entrepreneurs and business leaders to think about that, but you can't keep it out of the studio the way it has been for decades. I think you need to kind of rough that out in the design phase so you start building a skill set that starts to, in your own individual ways and around your own individual projects that you intersect with in your future career, what the economics of those specific things are.
Anybody want to pose some questions further?
Thank you. I'm very interested in the exploded grid for infrastructures you presented. Are you suggesting that the cost of these infrastructures are going from the government to the people, and like to put these small infrastructures in common, or
No.
just,
Usually if you're an elected official, it can't go back to the people. It can go to people who are investing in your city, and you can incentivize them to invest and build things in certain ways so that it will build your infrastructure. Historically, what has happened is intergovernmental banks like the Asia Development Bank or the World Bank would give loans to governments to build centralized infrastructural projects. Those are all behind. And most people are out of money. They've already tapped their debt margins, right? I can't speak for Thailand, but I can certainly speak for the US, which doesn't have access to funds from intergovernmental banks. But there is no lifeline of funding that an elected official could tap that wouldn't cost the taxpayers dollars. Typically, that's the only mechanism if you're continuing to go public, is I've got to tax you more for water. So what are other pathways other than taxing citizens more? That is likely to require private investment and development. And so mixed models, PPPs or public-private partnerships, are, all over the place. Standard Chartered's looking at them. A lot of private banks are looking at them. IFC, the International Finance Corporation, the private arm of the World Bank is looking at them. Blended finance is what that's called, is the current pathway that's being discussed, and that means it is unlikely to be a centralized system. They are, I mean, with power, that's easier. Water, because of gravity and the cost of pumping, it's even harder to do that. So what's important to recognize there is patchiness is good. And the more patches you get, maybe you can interconnect them someday. But patchiness is not necessarily bad. Singapore can centralize their water system, and they're tapping out financially. They're incredibly wealthy and small, and they're done financing it already. So what other country can afford to do that today? California has a new desal plant in Los Angeles that's centralized. They had to pass a bond for that that's effectively a loan. So looking for other pathways of revenue to finance that don't cost taxpayer dollars is the politics of the economics. And that is arguably the only realistic pathway to get caught up. Otherwise, we're just going to get further and further behind. So there's risk with that. There are different models, but I would argue that they're the right models to be testing and researching, and that higher education needs to curb the narrative that it's only public space and centralized infrastructure that they'll spend time on. They need to start collaborating with big money and private investment and economic incentives to figure out how to make patchy, decentralized infrastructures. There are operators that are looking at that. There are remote sensing companies that'll build sensors for buildings and can daisy chain buildings together to get the data to the city or the building operators. So that's a whole area that I think is the next generation of infrastructure that's much more 21st century. But technically, it shouldn't cost a taxpayer $1 if it's done right. But that's a, it's not a foregone conclusion. Yeah, there could be abuse, there's risk, there's a lot of concern, rightly so, but you get good, high quality early adopters, you get good banks who are securing and overseeing transactions, and you get good sensory networks in place to ensure that systems are being operated properly. I think you're on the right track.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anyone?
I want to ask you about solving the climate change by architecture. If there are too many conditions around, like in Bangkok, the water flooding is a huge problem for several years, but we don't have that flood area to build the smart city. I want to listen to your comment. What can architecture do, or there is another choice for not using landscape in solving the water flooding problem?
Well, Koch and I have talked about this in conferences and workshops. I think, we need to come together. There are good examples of landscape starting to behave like buildings. I would say Sentinel Park, is that a building or a landscape? You tell me. It's probably a little more landscape than building in terms of how it feels. And it's a pretty privileged, low-lying open space that a campus can afford. Can you do that in the central district of Bangkok? Probably not, right? So all the buildings that are going online, downtown, you need to amp up investment in that area and make it as dense as possible. So those are more vertical models. I know it's interesting to learn today when we did the tour of Sentinel Plaza that the two towers next door, that land process is involved in those, and there will be some connection vertically, right, to the landscape. And I think those kinds of experiments are really, really important to set the pathway forward. But it means architecture needs to have more landscape in it, but that does not mean that it's horizontal. So I think there are false binaries in coastal defense as much as there is in rainwater management, that typically blue-green means horizontal and hard and gray means vertical. I think an area that we can play a role is to break down those false binaries and think about how vertical systems can be green and blue also. You don't technically, at least in the US, if you're going to bring water into a building, you do not want to capture it from the ground. People have been walking around, a lot of toxins are on the ground, those have heavy metals, so the best place to capture water is a roof that people cannot go to. That's very clean. Then you bring it into the ground through pipes and you use that drop to generate electricity to pump it back up and filter it through the building. So vertical buildings can do a lot. And that, the study that I showed for New York, we could potentially satisfy 66% of the demand of gray water using roofs and facades in something like that kind of a configuration. But it means you have to believe that buildings can become part of the watershed. The financial side of that is tricky. I could talk at length about that, but you're talking about taking away more floor plate from developers to get additional water systems in the building. Every building, this room probably has pipes and water running all around it, probably coming off the roof that's above us. We're talking about adding to that capacity, which will take up more space. So there has to be financial incentives to think about how to make that work and design solutions that look at how to do that. But the short answer is roofs and facades are a quick pathway. Roofs, facades, and grounds are a quick way to bring that together in vertical landscapes, and that we could potentially play a role.
One more question. If the water didn't come from the rain, but it's come from the river, so it's not that clean.
Even if it comes from rain, it's not clean because it hits low-lying ground. In North America, that will never pass public health standards to even be used in a toilet because they'll be afraid that a baby could drink it and it has heavy metals in it. So that's technically no different than coastal water. You can recharge those systems and filter them, and Sentinel Plaza is a good example of that, to be used for other purposes. That's more difficult to get into a building. But very tall roofs in a building are fair game, I would argue, for bringing water into a building. So there's different kinds of work that buildings can collaborate with more traditional groundscapes on. But there's a reason why Sentinel Plaza, that water doesn't go into the building, into the toilets. I would guess it's probably a public health safety code that you're not allowed, even though that's not from the coast, which is potentially even, or a river is potentially even more toxic. It's just as soon as it hits ground, you have toxins on the ground that have to be cleaned. Yeah, there's a lot of discussions about that, but there's, you can still amp up capacity. It's just doubled up systems. Even that building, as Land Process was sharing with us earlier today, that's two systems. There's one that is reused more for the building and one that goes back into the landscape. So you might have doubled up systems and that takes up more space. So those are things that require design to think about how to get clever with that. Does that kind of, yes?
Okay. Respect of time, I think.
Great.
That's it for the Q&A. Thank you so much, Professor David Erdman, for your insightful and very valuable lecture. I think it fit really well with the theme of the lecture series, Architecture and Design for Society. So we have round of applause again for our next speaker. And for